Welcome, everybody. This is your captain speaking. Please prepare yourselves for an exciting flight on the way from our home in the Republic to the great Empire of Rome. Okay, sorry, realized that was a little overblown, but let's get started with this lecture. Hope everybody had a great weekend. Here are 4 key dates that are crucial in bringing Rome from its republican existence to the kind of bigger, greater form of government that we know of as a republic, as an empire. And of course, that gets started with the violence surrounding the Gracchi brother reforms in 133 BC, moves into the rise of the first new man, Marius, in 107 BC, also the first man to use his own, use his power, to in a corrupt way to kind of hold on to the consulship, the first person to hold so many successive consulships in a row. And then we have in 88 BC, Sulla, first Roman general to actually use his own troops to march on the city itself to fight against Rome. And so out and out civil war in 80 BC. And then we have 70 BC. It's not so violent, but it is still remarkable that Pompey is going to have his first consulship. What is more remarkable is that in his lifetime he will have 3, count them, 3 triumphal processions into the city. And it's going to put him in a place of power unlike anything Rome has ever seen before. And of course setting the stage ultimately for the powerful rise of the great Julius Caesar. But first, let's talk about Pompey the Great. This is a replica of one of his head sculptures here, pretty well returned, and you just think his haircut is about the best thing I've ever seen. Okay, first of all, a little background here on this guy. He fought for Sulla in his return to Rome, 83 BC, gained the title Magnus there, so that's why we call him Pompey the Great. But importantly, he kind of insisted on that title, so it wasn't like everybody was just, singing his praises. He was a great guy and did a lot of great stuff, but this dude was very, very ambitious. Second major contribution during that whole civil war between Marius and Sulla, or especially here between Sulla and the followers of Marius, even after Marius's death, is that he took Sicily back. Okay, Sicily had been taken by Populares legions. He fought and won it back. And then a year later, so this is a 3-year period, he even went over to North Africa and was able to defeat Populares legions in Numidia. And for all of this, there's the Numidia slide, sorry. For all this, he receives his first triumphal procession. Now, as you know, this is sort of every consul's great dream. Big problem is that Pompey's not a consul. He's a military tribune. He has not yet held a single office on the cursus honorum, and yet he comes back home and is greeted as imperator. He did this because he was able to just work the Senate over. He knew how to browbeat them into his own way, and so he cajoled and did everything he needed to, and eventually the Senate grants him a triumphal procession, even though the man is not a consul. So he comes home, he gets called imperator, yes, that's related to the word emperor, and he gets dressed up like this guy here is dressed up, which to the Romans made a person look like Jupiter. He's a god. So essentially, Pompey comes back, not even a consul, and gets treated like king for a day. So this is a remarkable thing. This puts Marius's innovations to shame. Really, this is something entirely new, entirely different, and obviously very remarkable. A humorous note is that when Pompey came back from Africa, he wanted to have elephants in the procession because they're a big part of African warfare. And so he had this huge arch built for himself to enter the city through, and he was going to bring all these elephants, but they don't fit through an arch, dummy. God, so all these elephants got stuck there, and the whole procession had a big traffic jam. I would have loved to have been in that crowd. That would have been hilarious. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about some lucky strokes that came Pompey's way And sorry, I just said Pompey, like the city near the volcano. It's wrong. Pompey, Pompey. Um, strokes of luck that really kind of brought him from being just an awesome military tribune to really Rome's first man. So, the first one is his encounter with a guy named Sertorius. Sertorius was a Populares general who had, after the Civil War, had kind of gone off to Spain, or ancient times we call it Hispania or even Iberia. Well, anyways, he'd gone there and had taken his legions with him and had actually kind of set himself up as a de facto, proconsul really in that area, even though he had no official authority from Rome. And he was a very, very successful man at this. He even gained the respect of the Spaniards living in there. He believed, essentially, and he kind of actually used this illustration, he believed that Rome could be defeated, his enemies especially could be defeated. And to show a person how he was going to do it, because of course Rome was an impressive power, he took a horse, a big mighty war horse, and he pulled the tail over, and he had this dubious general of his kind of watch, and he says, "I will defeat Rome like this." And he takes that horse's tail and he pulls out one hair at a time for several hours. And before long, the horse has no tail, but the horse hasn't been mad about it. It's been kind of maybe a little annoyed. And the point being that if you hit a little bit, eventually even something great like a horse's tail can be pulled out altogether. And so that was kind of his strategy for Rome. Well, he was very successful. Pompey and another guy we've heard of before, Metellus Pius, yes, same fella who had been sent to fight Jugurtha for some time in North Africa. These two men had been sent to deal with Sertorius and were having a horrible time. And Sertorius was getting the best of them in every way until one day one of Sertorius' own men assassinates him. After that, Pompey is able to defeat the Populares forces holding out. Okay, so that's his first stroke of good luck. Now, when he defeats them, of course, he wants to head back home. He's thinking, ha ha ha, another triumphal procession. But before he gets there, he gets news that something else is happening, and this is what it is. Kirk Douglas is on horseback. And that means one thing. Spartacus is leading a revolt. Now, here's Kirk Douglas playing the role of Spartacus, of course, famous movie. And Spartacus was a slave, and he led a gigantic slave revolt that began what's called the Third Servile War. Now, Pompey originally was not commissioned to deal with it. In fact, this fellow was Crassus. Crassus was your kind of consummate old man. Had tons of money, had lots of it, and had had it for a long time. Interestingly, though, he had made that money during all of the chaos around the civil wars, when citizens had been proscribed. Remember, that means you have to leave the town, drop everything, or you could be killed. And their property got burned up, or their houses got sold off in auction. He was just always right there, buying up property, going to the estate sales. Anyway, he just is kind of despicable, really, and he went through and just made tons of money off of all these properties that had been vacated during the different civil wars. So he was a very, very wealthy guy, even though he'd got it through questionable means. Now, he'd been sent down to deal with Spartacus, and while he was there, his men were having a hard time. These slaves were fighting for their freedom and their lives. They all knew what would happen if they were defeated. It was going to be a painful, slow death. And so these slaves were fighting with everything they had. Well, Crassus' men, now they're professional soldiers. They sort of lost heart and retreated one time against Crassus' own orders. And that's when Crassus revived an old practice called decimation. Decimation, literally, if you remember from vocabulary from classical roots, you'll remember that decimation actually means to take 1 in 10. Well, what Crassus did is he lined all his men up, and every 10th one of them he executed on the spot, just to give an example to the rest of his men what happens when you retreat. Okay, so Crassus was having a hard time, and then he did this decimation thing, so you can imagine that his men were not so happy. Morale was low. Okay? Morale was low. Nevertheless, he's going to be elected consul in 70 BC. More on that later. So Spartacus is here. He's whipping up on Crassus. Crassus's men don't even want to fight for him anymore. And Pompey, instead of going to Rome, just bypasses Rome, goes straight to the south of Italy, and takes on the Spartacus and the rest of his army. And when the two forces combine, now, of course, they're able to beat Spartacus pretty handily. And the fact is that Crassus, by the time Pompey showed up, Crassus was actually starting to get some momentum. But genius here is that Pompey shows up and gets treated like hero for a day. So he is essentially kind of gets all the glory, front page news. Pompey and Crassus defeat Spartacus. So this is like Pompey's second big headline in a very short period of time. Okay. Just as a side note, the slaves were condemned to death using a form of punishment that is, of course, very important to us as Christians, called the crucifixion. Here, about 6,000 slaves, that's 6,000, were taken alive and then crucified and left to die a slow death through suffocation, as you may have heard. That's how you die on the cross, by suffocating. They were left to die a slow death, and then their bodies were just left out to be eaten by birds, to rot in public. Again, this is kind of ancient brutality designed to set an example. Back to Pompey, though. For his victories here, he is given another triumphal procession. This is crazy. I mean, this is wild. This guy is got recognition, fame, like no one's ever had it before, and he's still very young. Same year he comes back, he gets elected consul alongside Crassus. Now, that was an interesting thing to do because they were from opposite sides. I mean, Pompey was a hero, really, of the people, okay? The other was the champion of the nobility and the Senate. And really what you have here is class warfare. You've got Crassus, the old man, Pompey, the new man. This is an odd little mix, and over time, Crassus is not going to get the upper hand. It's going to be Pompey, and that has a lot to do with his receiving a commission from a law called Lex Gambania. The Lex Gambania was basically an authorization for Pompey to go out and stop the pirates that had been kind of running amok in the Mediterranean. There was a huge problem with this. Now, Rome was becoming a kind of inter-Mediterranean power, and they were selling and sailing and doing commerce all over. But these pirates kept stopping their ships and robbing them, and they were losing all this money. So they commissioned Pompey to go out and stop this. And to do that, they said, basically, you have proconsular authority, which is like being a consul, but without so many regulations and rules like you'd have inside the city. He says you got proconsular authority all throughout the Mediterranean and 50 miles inland of any province of Rome. Now that's significant because most provinces of Rome extended about 50 miles inland from the shorelines of the Mediterranean. I mean, let's just say it like this. Pompey kind of had proconsular authority over everything that wasn't the city of Rome. I mean, everywhere he could advance 50 miles inland from the Mediterranean and basically claim to be kind of the sole unquestionable authority. And that's interesting because this puts him in a really powerful position, and he uses it well. He's going to capitalize on it. He's going to accomplish all kinds of great things and come back to Rome again, kind of a hero. But I want to stop for a minute and talk a little bit about a tangent in American politics. Now, in 2001, on September 11th, you realize, of course, that America was attacked. Worst attack since Pearl Harbor, and the United States responded with fear. I mean, we were terrified and angry. Okay, there's two things together. We were indignant and we were terrified. And when that happens, you can count on it that we're going to get violent. We're going to find something to do to kind of solve our problem because America has that kind of firepower. So what Congress did was they issued something called a Joint Resolution 64. And you can see it up here. I'll read it for you. It just says that the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, and persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. Now, the Constitution is set up so that the president always has to go to Congress to ask before he can use military force. Congress is supposed to have the sole right to declare war, and the president is the power to execute that war. Well, this kind of joint resolution is called an authorization to use military force. It's not quite a declaration of war, but it does give the president the power to use the armed forces. Well, if you look at this language, it's pretty vague. Some people say, gosh, it's a blank check. I mean, you put this together, and as long as you interpret an organization, person, nation even, to have anything to do with terrorism that may or may not have had some sort of direct or indirect influence on September 11th, well, then gosh, the president's allowed to fly over there and bomb at will. Here are some of the things that have been justified by this AUMF. Drone strikes in Yemen and Somalia. Longest war in American history, that is the War on Terror. Targeted killing of suspected terrorists, including at one point an American citizen. Yes, an American citizen who was probably involved in terrorism, but still just the point is that lots of people have been kind of killed on purpose, you might even say assassinated. The prison camp in Guantanamo Bay, yes, and even wiretaps in America. Now, you look at all of this, and you look at all that came from it, and I ask you, how many congresspeople, do you think voted against this? Remember, this is September 11th. Would you have voted against it? Well, there was one. One woman in all of Congress voted against it. She looked at it and said, this was Barbara Lee, she looked at it and said, this is too open-ended. We can't do this. We got to be more specific. We got to rewrite the joint resolution. So she was the only person in the House of Representatives. She's a Democrat from California. Only person. Well, now, I mean, several times since then, debates have come up, and many Congress people have voiced concern over the kind of standing power that this gives the president. I mean, just to let you know, whoever is the next president of the United States will still have this authorization to use military force when and whenever they want to. For voting against this, Representative Lee was called a traitor. She received death threats. She was, of course, castigated in the media, especially conservative media. But many have come to see her side of the story. And the question, I guess, that we all have to ask is, was she right to be worried? If we look at the history of Rome, then, we might say, wait a minute, I'm not sure we want to put so much power in the hands of one person, because as you can see from the history we're talking right now, we're moving slowly but surely toward the path to dictatorship, and Julius Caesar and then Augustus Caesar after him. Are we moving that way in America? Maybe not so dramatically. Are there still reasons to be concerned? Well, let's sort of leave that to you, and we'll get back to Rome. How about? Okay, 3 things that Pompey was able to accomplish while he was out under the authorization Lex Gabinius gave him. One was he definitely dealt with the pirates. Okay, he got rid of them and pretty well settled that issue, which was a big deal economically for Rome. Second thing, recognize that statue down there. Yes, that's Mithridates. He fought a 3rd war with Mithridates and sort of finally settled that problem once and for all, and gave Rome sort of a little bit more freedom to move around in Asia Minor. He even went down to the Middle East in Judea and settled a long-standing civil war between the Pharisees and the Sadducees that harkened all the way back to the Maccabean Revolt that began in 167 BC. Yeah, that's right. You remember that? Mattathias and his family led a revolt against the Hellenistic Seleucid rulers. Well, those Hasmoneans or Maccabeans had been in charge kind of since then for about 100 years. But things had not gone smoothly. There had been factions, there had been, fights and wars and civil wars, and basically the Jews kind of ultimately, half of them kind of invite the Romans to come in and take over. And so when Jesus is alive and conducting his ministry, the Romans are in charge, and it's easy to overlook the fact that they're there in large part because a lot of Jews wanted them to be there. So anyway, he does settle that problem. He ends up siding just, for what it's worth. He sides with the Pharisees temporarily. It's because at the time the Pharisees were the weaker party and they would have been easier to control. More on that later, perhaps. For now, you need to know this all ends with Pompey coming home to a third triumphal procession in 61 BC. He is easily the most powerful man in Rome, next to an outright dictator. And of course, his power is going to be bested only by the likes of a great, charismatic, and talented leader that we have come to know as Julius Caesar. That is it for today. I hope to see you tomorrow. We'll see how things go. But for now, this is the end of our lecture, and you have some reading to do. Bye, y'all.